Let me start this morning with a strange confession. I don't think I've ever been depressed in the clinical sense of the word. Have I been down for extended periods of time? Sure. Have I ever grieved the loss of a significant loved one? Sort of. And by sort of, I mean this. So far, thanks be to God, loss of a significant loved one hasn't included my spouse or one of my children or even one of my grandchildren. So thus, even in grief, comparatively, I'm a minor leaguer. So why the strange intro? Because the sad psalm that I'm turning to this week in our series of sad psalms may be of interest to some of you that are listening who do struggle with depression and mental health battles. If you do kind of find it relevant, that's great. But I certainly don't want to come across this morning as somebody who has little to no experience with such things, telling you that I have an answer to something that I haven't even had to ask the questions about so far in my adult life. I did read an interview of a book that's not even released yet, so the author's just being released about her upcoming book. And the author's name is Dana Groover, and her book title was interesting, Companions in the Darkness, 7 Saints Who Struggled with Depression and Doubt. And she was being interviewed on a website called The Weary Christian. Again, if you're somebody that struggles with depression, you might find that a good resource. But in her forthcoming book, she covers the biographies of 7 Christians, going as far back in history as Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and then moving forward even to contemporary ones. I really liked what I saw on the website. I liked the conversation between her and the webmaster based on things that I have learned from people that I love who have struggled with depression. I liked what she had to say. And based on things that I've heard from people that have never struggled with depression and give advice too easily, I liked what she had to say. Either way, if you're a battler of big D depression and you find some strength from the words from Psalm 77 this morning and its principles, great. God once spoke to a man through his donkey, so if he should use me to do so in speaking to you about something that I don't really understand all that well, then it's not completely unprecedented. So with that attempted disclaimer, let me talk about the small d depression that many of us may be dealing with entering the 3rd month of COVID-19 lockdown. Because I want to clarify for you at the front end the question I'm actually trying to answer in my sermon today. Is God still working out his plan to redeem for himself a people? You know, if Jesus said that he was going to build his church and the powers of hell would not prevail against her, then how do we understand the circumstances where we're sitting in our living rooms, again separated from one another, watching a guy whose haircut has an expired best before date, and he's still talking to a cell phone in the middle of an empty room? Well, if we go back in history to when these Psalms were being written, if your identity was inseparable from being one of God's chosen people, as the writer of Psalm 77 was, and if the experience of being chosen was inseparably tied to the promises made to you and your people that you would have a promised land, an inheritance, and if the anchor of that promise to have a promised land, an inheritance, was the sanctuary in the temple, in the city where God made his presence known and revealed, and if even that city and that temple were leveled and you were dragged off away from the promised land into exile, I think you get the idea that you very well may have found yourself with some pretty big questions. Psalm 77 is a pretty outstanding example of a song written by someone who's experiencing more than just a bad day. There are 20 verses here for us today in this psalm. The first 10 are really a proper lament. And I was thinking of a song that's familiar to us in the evangelical church. It's not a lament, but especially from the just recent kind of Billy Graham era of evangelism. And that hymn was called Just As I Am. And many a soul was encouraged to walk toward an opportunity to be embraced by the forgiveness of God through the work of Jesus Christ before they had gotten it all together, before they had cleaned their act together. They were encouraged to come to God just as they were. Well, our writer of this song shows himself praying to the God of Israel just as he was. Maybe that's the first lesson that we can get from this psalm, even before I've read any of it today. That it reminds me of there's an old Willie Nelson song that I stumbled across in the last few weeks called I'm Too Sick to Pray, which interestingly enough is actually a prayer. Well, these first verses kind of encourage us that we can pray our pain if we should choose to. So let me read for you verses 1 to 10 from Psalm 77. I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven. But my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for His help. You don't let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to pray. I think of the good old days, long since ended, when my nights were filled with joyful songs. I search my soul and ponder the difference now. Has the Lord rejected me forever? Will He never again be kind to me? Is His unfailing love gone forever? Have His promises permanently failed? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He slammed the door on His compassion? And I said, this is my fate. The Most High has turned His hand against me. Just a few reflections on what you've just heard. If you go back to verse 1, I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I thought of that line and heard that description of this man and his prayers, it took me back to Robert Duvall's Oscar-nominated role as the character Dewey, Sonny Dewey, I should say, from the 1997 film The Apostle. Because there's this scene in that film where Robert Duvall plays this outrageous character, this preacher, and he's praying. And I remember the scene, he's pacing in this upper room. And from outside the room, you can hear the shouts inside as he's alone in a room talking to God. And you would think that there was a fight going on inside. It made me think, when's the last time you talked or shouted loudly in prayer to God in a room all by yourself? Well, verse 1's character, he's doing that, but he's not even sure anybody's listening. Look at how he throws himself into it in verses 2 and 3. When I was in deep trouble, he's basically saying, I prayed all night. There's this line, with hands lifted up. And that sounds like a happy charismatic looking awkward at a Baptist church, but you could translate that line with hands lifted up or lifted toward heaven. You could translate that as hands wet with weeping. And the phrase that really jumped out at me this week, the curious one, is this one. But my soul was not comforted. Verse 3 finds himself at sunrise. He's still thinking about God, but he's still moaning, and he's overwhelmed with longing for God's help. What if I invited you to an all-night prayer meeting, and I sent you an email that said, hey, come on over to Renaissance at 7 tonight. We're gonna pray all night till our hands are wet with weeping, and in the morning you'll drive yourself home moaning and feeling more overwhelmed than when you arrived, longing for God's help. I don't think that we'd need to say come early because parking is limited. Can I throw a radical idea at you? When your soul let me say that again. When your soul refuses to be comforted, it might be worth listening to. Sometimes your soul knows better, and you should listen to it. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." When you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you're actually hungering and thirsting for God to make all things right. I can think of at least 4 legitimate reasons that your soul might refuse to be comforted. First, simply because some comforts are too weak. Some comforts are simply false. Some comforts are simply sinful. And some comforts may be none of the above, but they can be found prematurely when your soul knows that there's something much greater that it's waiting for. I read a quote just this week from an author counselor that I follow online. Her name's Sharon Hirsch. And she wrote this: "I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm doing okay with the coronavirus until I listen to the news. I have to remember this whole world is set up to dim our hope so that we will hope in God. He allows us to experience not steady, so we will long for the faithful one. We live in not love, so we will ache to be held by love. He lets us face sickness so that we will run to the healer." But before I move on, I do just want to point out that this author does pray, even though it's not fixing anything. Will that be how you'll look back at 2020? That you were in deep trouble and you prayed out loud and long and fervently. Thursday night at 7:30, you could join us online for half an hour. You'd have to plan your dinner schedule in such a way that you'd be able to log on and meet us for prayer, or else you might miss that meeting because you failed to plan. How about you cast your net with us rather than binge on your favorite cast on Netflix? But verse 4 to 6, they're familiar words to the insomniacs among us. He says in verse 4, "You don't let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to pray." If he was walking around shouting out his prayers in verse 1, by the time he gets to verse 4, he's silenced by distress. I have a question for you. Is it possible that you may actually be able to pray without even using words? I think based on our text it is. Verse 5 and 6 are some pretty awesome blues songs lyrics right there if you look at them that way. And he's thinking back to the better days when things were different. And better days can be pretty haunting. And you contrast verse 6 with verse 4, you can see the contrast right there. In verse 6 he's saying, he's remembering when his nights were filled with joyful songs. So back in verse 4 he'd been saying, "You don't even let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to speak." The last lines of this lament, there's 6 rapid fire questions. And I think the best way to really try them on is to leave them unanswered. What do I mean by that? Well, I don't think you really feel where this psalm means to take you if you don't just let these questions hang as real, honest questions. So I'm going to reread them without any comment. Has the Lord rejected me forever? Will he never again be kind to me? Is his unfailing love gone forever? Have his promises permanently failed? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he slammed the door on his compassion? And I said, "This is my fate. The Most High has turned his hand against me." How would you feel if you were at our Thursday night Zoom prayer meeting and one of us prayed those words. Especially if we landed it with those lines from verse 10, this is my fate. There's a person saying he's come to an acceptance that this is God's will for him in this situation that he's in. That's pretty dark stuff. But then I recall all you have done, O Lord, capital Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. Don't forget that back in verse 5 and 6, he was already reviewing better days. And it didn't work. Well, perhaps there's another prayer lesson for us right here, that we need to keep on remembering. We need to keep on telling the stories. So let me read verse 11 down to the end of our psalm. But then I recall all you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They're constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. O God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. You demonstrate your awesome power among the nations. By your strong arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the Red Sea saw you, O God, its waters looked and trembled. The sea quaked to its very depths. The clouds poured down rain. The thunder rumbled in the sky. Your arrows of lightning flashed. Your thunder roared from the whirlwind. The lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your road led through the sea, your pathway through the mighty waters, a pathway no one knew was there. You led your people along that road like a flock of sheep, with Moses and Aaron as their shepherds. So which story did he go to? The Exodus, the Red Sea crossing. That's been coming up a lot in this series, hasn't it? There's a reason for that. Each one of these Psalms in this series are from the Bible. And I've come to the conclusion from all my years of preaching and teaching and studying in the Bible that you can't go in any direction, very many pages either to the left or the right in any of our Bibles and not bump into stories of the Exodus. It seems to be that important. You can't go very far until you find yourself at one of the two shores of the Red Sea, or sometimes right in the middle of it. Parents, perhaps you want to raise kids that are literate when it comes to the Bible. It's not easy. I'm reminded of that every time one of my 3 adult children start one of their often repeated sentences about a Bible story or a doctrine with the lines like, I never knew that, or I never heard about that before. But I don't want you to despair. I don't want you to get stuck and think, well, where would you even start in helping your kids be literate in their knowledge of and love for the Bible? I'd say start with the Exodus stories. If not start there, at least make sure your kids know the stories of Egypt and the Pharaohs and the Passover and the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. I had an experience once about 15, 16 years ago where me and another man from our church were in an apartment with a young man who was kind of at the depths of despair. He was about to be evicted. He had no job. He had no idea where he was going to go, and his situation looked pretty hopeless. And I tried to bring him some comfort about a God that kind of knows a way out where there's no way out, and I tried to bring up what I thought was one of the most familiar stories in all of literature, the crossing the Red Sea, and it was complete blanks. And I couldn't believe that somebody could grow up in North America and be in his 30s and have never heard the stories of Moses and the Red Sea crossing. So make sure your kids know this one. But before we even get to the Red Sea crossing, we need to take a stop at the sanctuary. Verse 13 in my translation said, God, your ways are holy. The King James Version, if you can believe I'm saying this, is a really helpful translation of what that verse was really trying to get at. Because in the old KJV it said, Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Thy way is in the sanctuary. It's in worship. It's in worship that God's direction is most clearly seen and found. That's not a contradiction, obviously, with your way is holy or your way is in holiness. Because in worship, we're supposed to see God as He reveals Himself, as He really is, not our spin on what we want God to be like, because that ends up only being a God created in our own likeness, kind of an idol. And as I mentioned a sermon or two ago, all of the steps from the Jerusalem wall to the outer courts of the temple, through the court of Gentiles, into the inner court, into the Holy of Holies, right to the very kind of epicenter of God's holiness, the mercy seat, all the way in there. Every step from A to B creates an unmistakable, guided, prescribed journey to the core of who God is. The high priest coming only at the right time to that place to do only what they'd been trained to do and told to do, it all revealed God's holiness. We can think of that super important passage in Isaiah chapter 6 where he has the vision in the temple of God high and lifted up and His train fills the temple. So hold that thought. The thought that God reveals His greatness, and we're going to call that in the sanctuary way. Well, now let's look at the idea that He also reveals Himself in the sea way. If you look again in verses 15 to 18, here again is that Red Sea diary. And first of all, you think about that situation. They've been come out of Egypt in the Passover. They've come to a dead end at the side of the Red Sea. And now in the distance, Pharaoh's army's coming toward them. Try and put yourself in Moses' sandals on the front side of the Red Sea story. And as I thought about this week, I can just feel the leadership angst inside him. I can think of all the self-doubt in his head, like, oh, great, I've been set up. How could I have had so many clear signs and gotten it so wrong? Or how about average Joe Israelite? About the only life skill he'd ever been allowed to develop in his slave life was brick making. And he might be practicing a different form of that right about then. How about the woman's perspective? You've survived a government edict to euthanize all your male-born children. You've managed to covertly keep them alive for this. What's more terrible than to have an oncoming army you're pinned in and you have your children with you under your feet? And you have to remember that none of the people in that terrified multitude have ever seen the movie. The waters in front of them would not for a second appear to be a way of salvation. Add on to all that terror, the powerful electric storm in verse 17, as if the sounds of approaching hoofbeats and chariots weren't frightening enough. Let's jump all the way to verse 19. It's the takeaway lesson from history of all takeaway lessons. And it's this line, your pathway through the mighty waters, a pathway no one knew was there. A pathway no one knew was there. So contrast with me now the revelation of God that we called the sanctuary way on one hand with the sea way on the other hand. Because we may be in the midst of a seaway moment ourselves. On the one hand, the sanctuary way to find God's direction through His revelation of Himself is still a way. This way is unmistakable, it's crystal clear, it's expected, it's what you went there for in the first place, is to have a vision and understanding and see God as He really is. But in the other way, the sea way, He just shows up. Just in time, by our perspective at least, where you least expect it. In that sanctuary way, the steps of your approach were clearly defined. Here in the seaway, His pathway is hidden at the bottom of the sea. The NIV translates it as footprints that could not be seen. And I read this week from an old commentator that said His footprints could not be seen, and sometimes there's a great amount of time passes between footsteps. sometimes days, weeks, months, years, decades, even centuries. But then we add verse 20 to the picture, and we consider these words from Spurgeon about a path where no man can wade except God be with him, but where any man may wade, may walk if God take him by the hand. And that's these words, you led your people along that road like a flock of sheep, with Moses and Aaron as their shepherds. It sounds so easy, doesn't it? Just following along like sheep behind two capable guides. Well, you have to remember that conclusion of this psalm. They're following along like sheep behind two capable guides along a pathway that nobody knew even existed, that they couldn't see, that they were completely blind to. All in all, we've got a song of praise written by a man who at one point recounts how he had been silenced by despair. He goes from deep trouble to deep water, and he emerges on the other side singing. And he means to take us with him. So what do we conclude from this song? Well, it's a song and a collection of songs for people in exile. You got to remember, they're no longer even in the promised land when this song collection is put together. They no longer have even access to the crystal clear views that you would find in the sanctuary. So why would it be so important to take trips down to Memory Lake? Because God is faithful and consistent. When he reveals something about himself, as in the Red Sea Diaries, he doesn't do it because he's learning something about himself. He does it to teach us something about himself. God called the Israelites out of Egypt, and he had many centuries earlier promised to their ancestor Abraham land and inheritance where they would be his people. He was thus at the side of the Red Sea, leading them toward the fulfillment of his promises, even though they could not see how he was going to do it. They were to trust him. Well, God has called us out into the world to preach the gospel and baptize people and teach them to obey everything he's taught us, with the promise that he will be with us always, even to the end of the age. Right now, we are perhaps at a Red Sea type situation. If we are, we have no reason to despair about his nearness, about his awareness or care for us, because he is a pathway no one knew was there kind of God. There is great power in our belief in a God who still does right arm acts. He still knows a way out where there was no way out. He has not finished what he started, and we know from history that he always finishes what he started. So when Paul says in Philippians chapter 1 that he was writing to all God's holy people in Philippi who belong to Christ Jesus, including the church leaders and deacons, well, we can just kind of listen on like he's writing directly to us. And listen what Paul wrote to that church in Philippi. May God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ give you grace and peace. Every time I think of you, I give thanks to my God. Whenever I pray, I make my requests for all of you with joy, from prison, I might add. For you have been my partners in spreading the good news about Christ from the time you first heard it until now. Here's the killer takeaway verse. This is why we can take so much comfort from the Red Sea story. Paul writes, and I'm certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it's finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. I want to close with Paul's prayer that he writes in the next lines. And I want to pray them for you. And as you listen to his words that form my prayer, I want you to take note that every single word of hope in this prayer from the first chapter of Philippians is 100% pandemic proof. So let me close with this prayer. I pray that your love will overflow more and more, and that you will keep on growing in knowledge and understanding. For I want you to understand what really matters, so that you may live pure and blameless lives until the day of Christ's return. May you always be filled with the fruit of your salvation, the righteous character produced in your life by Jesus Christ, for this will bring much glory and praise to God. Amen. If you're from Renaissance, once again, I hope that you'll join us at 11:40 this morning for our after-church fellowship. And if you have any kind of questions or needs, there's any way we can help you hear from our church, you can contact us online at BrooklinRBC.ca. God bless.